It can't be. No, it's me. Eliza Munro's whispered words were swallowed by the crushing silence of the billionaire's private study. Her fingers, icy and trembling, threatened to send the silver tray she carried crashing to the polished marble floor. There, under a soft, deliberately angled spotlight, hung a small, ornately framed portrait. A little girl no older than 5, with a cascade of unruly dark curls and a shy, achingly familiar smile. She wore a simple dress the color of forget-me-nots, her smile, the faint memory of her dress. But how could this ghost from her own forgotten childhood be hanging like a prized secret treasure on Julian Vance's wall? A man whose existence she hadn't known until hours ago, a man she was merely here to serve. The air crackled with an impossible, terrifying question. A cold voice, smooth as ice, yet sharp as glass, sliced through her dawning horror. "You seem to have lost your way, Miss Munro." Julian Vance stood, framed in the doorway, his eyes not on the precarious tray, but fixed on Eliza's face, then with a chilling flicker towards the portrait, and back to her. What unspeakable connection does this powerful billionaire have to a past Eliza never even knew she'd lost? If this shocking discovery has your mind racing with questions, hit that subscribe button and share your theories in the comments below, because the answer will unravel a secret far more sinister than you can imagine. The city of Chicago hummed its relentless tune, a symphony of hurried footsteps, distant sirens, and the rumble of the L train. For Eliza Munro, it was the soundtrack to a life carved out of sheer will and quiet perseverance. At 24, her days were a blur of starched aprons, polite smiles, and the clatter of plates at the daily grind, a downtown diner where tips were modest and dreams were often deferred. Each evening she returned to her small studio apartment, a space just big enough for one where the city's cacophony faded to a distant murmur, leaving a silence that often felt heavier than any sound. Eliza was a survivor, a product of the foster care system, a childhood pieced together from a patchwork of different homes, different faces, none of which had ever truly felt like her own. She carried no bitterness, only a resilient spirit and a carefully guarded ache in the pit of her stomach, a longing for a past she couldn't remember, for a sense of belonging that remained stubbornly out of reach. There were no photographs, no stories, just a void where her beginnings should have been. Her only tangible link to that lost era was a small, intricately carved wooden bird, smooth and dark, with age clutched so often its edges were softened. She'd found it tucked into the pocket of a donated coat when she was 7, and from that moment it became her silent confidant, her most precious, inexplicable treasure. Sometimes a melody would drift into her mind, a lullaby so faint she could never quite catch its entirety, yet it brought a pang of something akin to home. Or was it just a wistful fantasy, a tune her own lonely heart had composed? She didn't know, and not knowing was a constant low hum beneath the surface of her otherwise pragmatic existence. One crisp October afternoon, a Lifeline manager of the daily grind, a man named Sal, who had a gruff exterior but a surprisingly kind heart, called her over. "Eliza," he began, wiping his hands on his apron, "got a call. High-end catering gig. Big Shots mansion up on the North Shore. Needs extra servers for a charity gala tonight. Pays triple what you make here in a good week. You in triple." The word resonated. It meant rent paid on time, a little tucked away for the art classes. She dreamed of a momentary reprieve from the constant financial juggling act. "I'm in, Sal." "Definitely in," she said, a small, grateful smile touching her lips. Later that evening, as the taxi pulled through imposing wrought-iron gates and up a long, winding driveway, Eliza felt a knot tighten in her stomach. The Vance estate. Even the name sounded old, powerful, a world away from her own. The mansion loomed before her, a magnificent stone edifice glowing with warm light against the twilight sky, its windows like 100 watchful eyes. It wasn't just big. It was colossal, a testament to the kind of wealth that could shape realities, create dynasties, and perhaps hide secrets. She straightened her borrowed black uniform, took a deep breath, and followed the other temporary staff through a service entrance. Inside, the opulence was breathtaking, but in a way that felt almost oppressive. Marble floors gleamed under crystal chandeliers, priceless art adorned walls panelled in dark, rich wood, and the air itself seemed to hum with an unspoken Jai-Joan of affluence. As she was directed towards the main ballroom, a strange sensation prickled at the back of her neck. Walking down a long, hushed corridor, her sensible shoes silent on the plush runner, she passed a series of arched alcoves. In one, a shaft of moonlight from a tall window illuminated a particular pattern in the flocked wallpaper, a subtle swirl of ivy and roses. For a fleeting, inexplicable moment, her heart stuttered. Familiar. The thought was a whisper, instantly dismissed. How could anything in this palace of a house be familiar to her? She'd never set foot in a place like this in her life. She shook her head, attributing the feeling to nerves, to the sheer alienness of her surroundings. Yet a little later, as she helped arrange silver trays of canapes on a massive mahogany sideboard, the scent of lilies, heavy and sweet from an enormous floral display in the grand foyer, wafted towards her. Again that jolt. Not a memory, not quite. More like an echo, a phantom scent from a dream she couldn't recall. It was unsettling, like a word mushin, forgotten on the tip of her tongue. The head caterer, a stern woman with a clipboard, gave curt instructions, and Eliza focused, pushing the strange sensations aside. She was a professional here to do a Jai-Joan. But as the evening progressed, and she navigated the labyrinthine service hallways and grand rooms, these echoes persisted small and insignificant on their own, yet collectively creating a disquieting undercurrent. The curve of a particular banister her fingers brushed against, the distant chime of a grandfather clock, its tone deep and resonant, a specific shade of blue in a tapestry that hung in a dimly lit study, she glimpsed through an open door. Each instance was a tiny pinprick, a flicker of something, just beyond the veil of her consciousness. She told herself it was an overactive imagination, fueled by the unfamiliar grandeur and the pressure of the Jai-Joan. What else could it be? These were the abodes of billionaires' men like Julian Vance, whose name was synonymous with power and influence in Chicago and beyond. Men whose lives were chronicled in business journals, not in the fragmented, nameless past of a girl raised in foster care. Still, as the first guests began to arrive, their laughter and polite chatter, a stark contrast to the quiet turmoil within her, Eliza found her hand drifting to the pocket of her apron where the small wooden bird rested. She touched its smooth surface, a subconscious gesture of seeking an anchor in a sea of unsettling phantom sensations. The Vance estate was magnificent, a dazzling display of wealth. But for Eliza Munro, it was beginning to feel like something else entirely, a house of whispers, of faint, spectral echoes from a life she never knew she'd lost. And a deep, unnameable foreboding began to settle in her heart, a premonition that the night held more than just a lucrative Jai-Joan. It held a key, perhaps, to the very door of her forgotten past. The grand ballroom of the Vance estate was a dizzying kaleidoscope of shimmering gowns, sharp tuxedos, and the murmur of 100 conversations, all underscored by the sophisticated strains of a live jazz quartet. Eliza Munro moved through the throng with practiced efficiency, her tray held high, her expression a mask of polite neutrality. Yet beneath the surface, the unsettling echoes from earlier still resonated, making the gilded opulence around her feel strangely brittle, almost unreal. An hour into the gala, a minor crisis erupted in one of Shirley the more exclusive antechambers. A spilled tray of champagne, a flustered junior server. The head caterer, her face a mask of controlled panic, spotted Eliza. "Monroe, I need you to fetch a fresh supply of the Paul Roger from the East Wing cellar access. Quick as you can. Use the service corridor past the main library, it's faster." The East Wing. Eliza hadn't been instructed to go there. It felt further removed from the orchestrated chaos of the main event. She nodded, her heart giving an odd little thump, and slipped away from the glittering crowd. The service corridor was quieter, lined with closed doors and portraits of stern-faced ancestors Eliza didn't spare a glance for. She was focused on her task, on the directions given. But the caterer's instructions had been slightly vague, and at what she thought was the correct juncture, she took a left turn instead of a right, finding herself in a more ornately decorated hallway, evidently part of the Vance family's private quarters. Silence pressed in a heavy velvet curtain after the ballroom's clamour. Rich dark wood panelling rose to meet a coffered ceiling, and the air was still carrying only the faint, lingering scent of old books and beeswax. Realizing her mistake, Eliza paused, about to turn back, when her eyes were drawn to a small, solitary portraiture photograph at the end of the passage. It was illuminated by a discreetly angled sconce, its placement suggesting personal significance, not mere decoration. Curiosity, or perhaps some deeper unseen current, pulled her forward. As she drew closer, her breath hitched. The image was of a little girl no more than 4 or 5 years old, with a cascade of dark, unruly curls, much like her own had been at that age before life and practicality had tamed them. The child in the photo wore a simple dress of a soft forget-me-not blue, and her smile was shy, a little hesitant, yet with a spark of mischief in her dark eyes. Eliza's hand flew to her mouth, her tray clattering precariously. The world tilted. It couldn't be. It was impossible. Yet the resemblance was not just striking, it was absolute. The set of the jaw, the slight upturn of her nose, the very light in those childish eyes. It was like looking at a ghost of herself, a phantom from a past she had no claim to. The blue dress, a colour that sometimes surfaced in her most fleeting dreamlike images, a hue she'd always felt an inexplicable fondness for. Her blood ran cold, then hot. No, she whispered the sound, swallowed by the opulent silence. It can't be me. But even as she denied it, a chilling certainty began to crystallize in her soul. This was not just a girl who looked like her. This was her. Her fingers, numb and trembling, reached out as if to touch the glass. But she stopped herself. The frame was heavy, ornate, silver, clearly expensive. The photograph itself was slightly faded, yet preserved with obvious care. Why was a picture of her, a forgotten child of the foster system, hanging here in the heart of Julian Vance's palatial home? Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through the shock. She was in a private area, uninvited. If she were found, she had to leave now. But her feet felt rooted to the plush carpet. Her gaze devoured the image, memorizing every detail. The tiny, almost imperceptible dimple beside the child's mouth, the way a single curl fell across her forehead, the slightly scuffed toe of one small shoe. This was a piece of her, a piece she never knew existed, displayed like a precious relic. A faint sound from the far end of the corridor, the soft click of a door, jolted her into action. Adrenaline surged. She spun around her heart, hammering against her ribs, and practically fled, her earlier composure shattered. She found the correct service passage, her mind a maelstrom of disbelief and dawning terror. She almost collided with a figure rounding the corner, a tall, imposing silhouette that resolved itself into Julian Vance. His eyes, the color of ice, flickered over her, taking in her flushed face, her slightly disheveled appearance. They were eyes that missed nothing. "Lost, are we?" His voice was smooth, a low baritone that held no warmth, only a cool, assessing quality. It wasn't a question. It was a statement laced with an unspoken challenge. Eliza's throat went dry. No, sir. Mr. Vance. Just retrieving something for the caterer." She forced the words out, hoping her voice didn't betray the violent tremor that had taken hold of her. Vance's gaze lingered on her for a moment longer, a moment that stretched into an eternity. A faint, almost imperceptible smile, if one could even call it that, touched the corner of his lips. "See that you stick to the designated areas, young lady. This house has many corridors. It's easy for those unfamiliar to find themselves in unexpected places." The implicit threat veiled in polite language sent a shiver down her spine. He knew, or he suspected. She offered a mumbled apology and hurried past him, her skin prickling, acutely aware of his gaze following her until she turned the corner. Safely back in the bustling anonymity of the service areas, Eliza leaned against a cool stone wall, gasping for breath, the crystal glasses on her hastily retrieved tray rattling softly. The image of the little girl in the blue dress, her image was seared into her mind. Julian Vance's cold eyes, his veiled warning. The shock was beginning to recede, replaced by a maelstrom of other emotions. Confusion, a profound sense of violation, and then a slow, burning ember of anger. This wasn't just a mistake, a coincidence. Her childhood photograph framed like a treasure in the home of one of the city's most powerful men, a man who had looked at her as if she were an insect. It was a secret that involved her, a secret that for 24 years had defined her life without her even knowing it. The small wooden bird in her pocket suddenly felt heavier, no longer just a curious keepsake, but a potential clue, a link to a story she had been denied. The gala, the guests, the demanding Jaijoan, all of it faded into insignificance. There was only one thing that mattered now. She had to know why, and she would, no matter what it took, no matter who Julian Vance was. The Vance Estate Gala ended in the small hours of the morning, but for Eliza, Monroe's sleep was an impossibility. Back in the stark solitude of her studio apartment, the city's distant hum did little to soothe the storm raging within her. The image of that little girl in the forget-me-not blue dress, her image, was burned onto the backs of her eyelids. Julian Vance's icy gaze, his silken veiled threat echoed in her ears. Fear, a cold, coiling serpent, twisted in her gut. It would be so easy to let it paralyze her, to dismiss the photograph as a bizarre, inexplicable anomaly, to shrink back into the relative safety of her anonymous life. She pulled the small wooden bird from her pocket. Its familiar smoothness was a small comfort in the overwhelming chaos of her thoughts. This bird, her only link to an unknown past, now felt charged with a new urgent significance. The photograph wasn't an anomaly. It was a signpost pointing towards a truth that had been deliberately, perhaps cruelly concealed. The fear was real, potent, but something else was stirring within her now, a fierce, unyielding resolve. She had been a ghost in her own life for too long. It was time to find out who she was and why she had been erased. But where to begin? Julian Vance was a titan, a billionaire whose influence stretched into every corner of Chicago, and likely far beyond. She was a waitress with empty pockets and a past that was a gaping wound. The imbalance was terrifying. Then a name surfaced from the recesses of her memory: Oscar Kowalski, a veteran bartender, a fixture in the city's more exclusive establishments for decades. He wasn't just a server. He was an institution, a discreet repository of the city's whispered secrets, the kind that were traded over expensive scotch in dimly lit lounges. Sal at the Daily Grind had once mentioned him, a grudging respect in his voice. Oscar. That old coot's seen more than most priests, and forgotten more than most historians know. If anyone knew anything about the shadows in Julian Vance's gilded world, it would be Oscar. It took her 2 days to work up the courage, and another to track him down. He wasn't at any of the glittering hotel bars listed in society columns. She found him instead at a quiet, old-fashioned neighborhood tavern on the west side, a place with worn wooden floors and the comfortable scent of stale beer and camaraderie. He was off duty, nursing a whiskey at a corner table, his face a road map of interesting lines, his eyes shrewd but not unkind. Eliza approached him hesitantly, her heart thumping. Mr. Kowalski, Oscar. He looked up, a flicker of surprise in his eyes, then a slow, appraising regard. Most folks just call me Oscar Dare, and you are Eliza Munro. Sal from the Daily Grind. He mentioned you. Oscar's lips curved into a faint smile. Ah, Sal. Still grinding away, is he? So, Eliza Munro, what brings a bright young thing like yourself to an old dinosaur like me in a place like this? Eliza sat her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She started carefully, vaguely mentioning she'd worked an event at the Vance estate, that she was curious about the family. Oscar chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. Curious about the Vances, eh? That's like being curious about a sleeping dragon. Best not to poke too hard. He took a slow sip of his whiskey. Julian Vance. Now there's a man who built an empire. Some say on brains and grit, others whisper other things. Eliza leaned forward, her voice barely above a whisper. What other things, Oscar? He studied her face for a long moment, his gaze probing. You got a particular reason for this curiosity, Eliza. More than just idle chatter. When Eliza hesitated, a shadow of the fear she felt crossing her features. He sighed. All right. But you didn't hear it from me, understand? He lowered his voice. Vance wasn't born with that silver spoon. He clawed his way up. Married into his first real money, they say. A woman named Lydia. Lydia Beaumont, she was, before she became Lydia Vance. Lydia Vance. Eliza repeated the name, feeling strangely significant, though she didn't know why. Aye, a firebrand she was by all accounts. Passionate about her causes, especially children's rights. Came from old money herself, but the kind that still had a conscience. Not like Julian's kind, which mostly just has an appetite. Oscar swirled the amber liquid in his glass. Then one day, she was gone. Car accident, they called it. Very tragic, very sudden. Eliza felt a chill creep up her spine. And Julian Vance inherited a considerable fortune from her. Oscar said, his voice flat, poured it into his ventures. That's when Vance Industries really took off, started swallowing up competitors. Funny how tragedy can sometimes be profitable. He gave Eliza a pointed look. People like Julian Vance, Eliza, they don't just have money, they have power. The kind that makes inconvenient truths disappear. He paused, then added, his voice even lower. There were whispers back then, too, about a child, a little girl, Lydia and Julian's daughter. After Lydia died, the girl, well, she just wasn't mentioned anymore. Vanished from the picture, you might say. Most assumed she'd been sent away to boarding school overseas or to live with distant relatives to shield her from the tragedy. But no one ever seemed to know for sure. Eliza's breath caught in her throat. A little girl. Vanished. The air in the quiet tavern suddenly felt thick, heavy with unspoken implications. "Look, kid," Oscar said, his tone softening slightly as he saw the look on her face. "Julian Vance is not someone you want to cross. If you're just curious, let it go. Some doors are best left unopened, especially when you don't know what monsters might be lurking behind them." He offered a wry smile. "Billionaires, you see, they're a bit like us, Eliza. They put their pants on one leg at a time. Only difference is their pants are usually made by some Italian fellow named Armani, and they've got enough spare change in the pockets to buy a small country. And their secrets, well, their secrets tend to have more zeros attached to them, too." Eliza managed a weak smile in return for his attempt at lightening the mood, but his words had landed like stones in her stomach. Vanished from the picture. The phrase echoed the image of her own photograph, hidden away in that private hallway. She thanked Oscar, her mind reeling. He'd given her more than just rumors. He'd given her names, timelines, a glimpse into the abyss that might be her own past. As she stepped out of the tavern and back into the indifferent city streets, the shadows seemed longer, deeper. Oscar's warnings replayed in her mind, but stronger still was the image of the little girl in the blue dress. The first few puzzle pieces were on the table, and they formed a terrifying, almost unbelievable picture. She was walking into a storm, she knew it. But turning back was no longer an option. The ghost of that little girl, her ghost, wouldn't let her. Oscar's words, heavy with warning and grim supposition, settled over Eliza Munro like a shroud. The initial adrenaline of her discovery at the Vance estate had given way to a chilling awareness of the abyss she was peering into. Julian Vance wasn't just a name in society pages. He was a formidable power, shielded by layers of wealth and influence. Rumors and a single inexplicable photograph were not weapons. They were whispers in a hurricane. She needed facts, evidence, something solid enough to confront the monumental lie that seemed to be her life. She needed someone who knew how to navigate the treacherous currents of secrets and deceit. Her mind, sharpened by years of fending for herself, began to work with a new, focused intensity. She remembered articles she'd occasionally scanned during slow shifts at the diner stories of old Chicago cases, unsolved mysteries, and the tenacious investigators who'd pursued them. One name had lodged in her memory, more for the sheer audacity of the cases taken on than for any recent headlines. Eleanor Hayes, a private investigator, now supposedly retired, who had a reputation for being as unyielding as granite and twice as sharp. If anyone could unearth secrets buried deep by a man like Julian Vance, it might be her. Finding Eleanor Hayes wasn't easy. She wasn't listed, had no splashy website. It took Eliza a week of discreet inquiries, of sifting through old news archives at the public library, and finally, a cautiously offered tip from a retired police contact Oscar had reluctantly provided after much persuasion. Eleanor Hayes, it turned out, lived in a modest, slightly ramshackle bungalow in a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood, far from the glittering towers of the Loop. Eliza stood before the faded blue door, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She clutched her purse, the small wooden bird a comforting weight inside. This was it. If Eleanor Hayes turned her away, she didn't know what she would do next. The door opened to reveal a woman in her late 60s, her silver hair cut in a no-nonsense bob, her eyes the color of shrewd assessing steel. She wore a cardigan over a simple blouse and jeans and a pair of reading glasses cant perched on her nose. There was an air of formidable intelligence about her, and a distinct lack of patience for fools. Ms. Hayes Eliza began, her voice a little unsteady. Depends who's asking, the woman replied, her tone neutral, her gaze unwavering. My name is Eliza Munro. I need to talk to you about something important. Something I think only you can help me with. Eleanor Hayes looked her up and down, a slow, deliberate appraisal. I'm retired, Miss Munro. My days of chasing shadows are over. I chase stray cats and overdue library books now. Far less stressful. Please, Eliza persisted, a note of desperation creeping into her voice. It's about Julian Vance. At the mention of Vance's name, a flicker of something, interest, or perhaps just old reflex, crossed Eleanor's face. She considered Eliza for another long moment, then sighed a sound like dry leaves rustling. All right, come in. But I'm not making any promises. And the coffee's terrible, I warn you now. The inside of the bungalow was crammed with books and files, a testament to a life spent sifting through information. Eliza sat on the edge of a worn armchair as Eleanor poured 2 mugs of what indeed proved to be very strong, very bitter coffee. So Eleanor said, settling opposite her Julian Vance, "You're a waitress, if I'm not mistaken from your slightly harried demeanor. What's a waitress got to do with a billionaire titan unless he stiffed you on a very large tip?" There was a hint of dry amusement in her voice, but her eyes remained sharp. Eliza took a deep breath and began her story. She told Eleanor about the gala, the private hallway, the photograph of the little girl in the forget-me-not blue dress. She described the uncanny resemblance, the overwhelming certainty that it was her. She recounted Oscar's warnings, the rumors about Lydia Vance's sudden death, the vanished child. As she spoke, her initial nervousness gave way to a passionate conviction, her words tumbling out with an urgency that even she hadn't realized she possessed. Eleanor listened intently, her expression unreadable, occasionally making a small note on a pad. When Eliza finished, a heavy silence filled the room. A photograph, Eleanor finally said, her voice flat, and a bartender's tale. You want to go up against Julian Vance, a man who probably has judges and half the police force on his speed dial. Based on that, Miss Munro, you've either got more courage than sense, or you've been watching too many detective movies. She paused. Or, there's something more you're not telling me. Eliza hesitated, then reached into her purse and pulled out the small wooden bird. She placed it on the cluttered coffee table between them. This is all I have from before. I don't know where it came from. But the girl in the photo, the blue of her dress, sometimes I dream of that color. And this bird, she trailed off, unable to explain the intangible connection. Eleanor picked up the bird, turning it over in her fingers. Her expression remained neutral, but Eliza thought she saw a new attentiveness in her eyes. This carving, it's unusual, almost folk art, but with a certain refinement. She looked back at Eliza. All right, Miss Munro. Let's assume for a moment your wild theory isn't entirely fueled by bad coffee and an overactive imagination. What exactly do you want me to do? Find out the truth, Eliza said, simply, her gaze direct. Find out if that little girl was me. And if she was, find out what happened to her. What happened to Lydia Vance. Eleanor was silent for what felt like an age. Then a ghost of a smile, a wry, knowing look touched her lips. This is going to cost you more than you can afford, you know. And it could get very, very dangerous. I don't have much money, Eliza admitted. But I can work. I'll do anything. Clean your house, organize these files. She gestured around the room. As for danger, I think living a lie I don't understand is more dangerous." Eleanor Hayes actually chuckled, then a dry, surprising sound. "You've got spirit, I'll give you that. And this old bloodhound," she tapped her chest, "hasn't had a decent scent to follow in years. All right, Eliza Munro, I'll take a sniff around. No promises, mind you. But I'll see what bones we can dig up on Julian Vance and his first wife." She leaned back, a new energy in her demeanor. "First things first, that coffee you make had better be an improvement on mine, because we're going to need a lot of it." Over the next few weeks, Eleanor Hayes, with Eliza, assisting where she could, mostly with late-night online research and endless cups of surprisingly good coffee, began to peel back the carefully constructed layers of Julian Vance's past. Eleanor was a whirlwind of quiet efficiency, calling on old contacts, navigating bureaucratic mazes, and sifting through digital and paper trails with an expertise that left Eliza in awe. Initial findings were sparse, but intriguing. Lydia Vance's death certificate listed accidental death due to a single car crash on a rainy night. But Eleanor found a brief mention in an old archived police blotter of a witness who claimed to have seen another vehicle near the scene, a detail that never made it into the official report. Financial records from that period were harder to come by. Many seemed to have been sealed or had simply disappeared. Julian Vance's charitable foundation, established shortly after Lydia's death, in her memory had an impeccable public image, but its early funding sources were opaque. As Eleanor dug deeper, a subtle resistance began to manifest. An old contact in the city archives suddenly became uncooperative. A digital file they'd been trying to access was inexplicably corrupted. One evening, as Eliza left Eleanor's bungalow, she had the distinct chilling sensation of being watched, the hairs on the back of her neck prickling. She dismissed it as nerves, but the feeling lingered. "We're ruffling feathers, Eliza," Eleanor said one evening, her expression grim as she looked up from a newly acquired, heavily redacted document. "And these are not the kind of birds you want swooping down on you." She tapped a faded photograph of Lydia Vance, young, vibrant, her eyes full of fire. This woman was a fighter. Whatever happened to her, whatever happened to that little girl in your photograph, it wasn't simple. And Julian Vance will do anything to keep it buried. The path ahead was indeed thorny, Eliza realized, more so than she could have ever imagined. But with Eleanor Hayes by her side, a formidable and an unexpectedly witty ally, she felt a flicker of something she hadn't dared to feel before, a fragile, dangerous hope. The biting Chicago wind of late November seemed to seep through the very walls of Eleanor Hayes's small bungalow, mirroring the chill that had settled deep in Eliza Munro's bones. Weeks had bled into one another each day, a tense oscillation between hope and a gnawing dread, as Eleanor meticulously pieced together the fragmented puzzle of Julian Vance's past. Eliza had continued her shifts at the diner, the mundane routine a strange counterpoint to the seismic shifts occurring beneath the surface of her life. She learned to read the subtle cues in Eleanor's demeanor, a tightening of her jaw, a prolonged silence, the almost imperceptible gleam in her steely eyes when a new piece of information clicked into place. One evening, Eliza arrived at the bungalow to find Eleanor sitting at her cluttered desk, an array of documents spread out before her, like a grim tarot reading. The air in the room was thick with an unspoken intensity. Eleanor looked up, her face etched with a weariness Eliza hadn't seen before, but also with a grim sort of triumph. "Sit down, Eliza," Eleanor said, her voice quieter than usual. I think I've found what we were looking for, or perhaps what we were afraid of finding." Eliza's heart leapt into her throat. She sat, her hands gripping each other in her lap. Eleanor began, her voice methodical, laying out the evidence piece by damning piece. First, there was a heavily redacted coroner's report on Lydia Vance obtained through a reluctant, decades-old contact. Eleanor, with her practiced eye, had spotted inconsistencies. A timeline that didn't quite add up, a witness statement about that other vehicle near the crash site that was dismissed far too quickly, almost deliberately. Then came the financial records, ones Julian Vance had clearly thought long buried. Eleanor had unearthed them through a series of painstaking digital reconstructions, and by calling in a significant favor from a forensic accountant she'd once helped out of a G.I. Joan. They showed a sudden massive influx of capital into Vance's fledgling company immediately following Lydia's death, not just from Lydia's considerable personal estate, but from a life insurance policy on her, a policy whose payout was significantly larger than seemed reasonable for their circumstances at the time. He benefited, Eliza Eleanor stated, her voice devoid of emotion. Massively. Lydia's death was the springboard for his empire. Eliza felt a wave of nausea. The man who paraded his philanthropy, who spoke of his tragic loss at galas, had built his fortune on the grave of his wife. But Eleanor wasn't finished. She slid a set of faded, almost brittle documents across the desk. These were harder to find. Buried deep in archived county records, misfiled almost certainly intentionally. It took some creative persuasion to access them. Eliza looked down. Her breath hitched. It was a birth certificate. Her birth certificate. Eliza Lydia Monroe. Mother Lydia Beaumont Vance. Father Julian Croft Vance. And then beside it, another document dated approximately a year after Lydia's death, a petition filed by Julian Vance to have his daughter, Eliza, Lydia Vance, declared legally deceased, lost and presumed dead. Following a supposed tragic accident during a private boating trip, her body never recovered. It was accompanied by a shockingly convincing, albeit forged, death certificate. "He didn't just abandon you," Eliza Eleanor said softly, the steel in her voice now laced with a rare touch of compassion. "He erased you, declared you dead." And then she pushed another file forward he collected on a life insurance policy, taken out in your name as well. Not as substantial as Lydia's, but enough. Enough to add another layer of bricks to his rising empire. The room spun. Eliza stared at the papers, the official-looking stamps, the cold typewritten words that declared her non-existence. Lost and presumed dead. She was a ghost, a legal fiction created by the man who was her father, the man whose eyes had dismissed her with such casual disdain at the gala, the man whose photograph, her photograph as a living child, hung like a secret trophy in his private domain. Tears, hot and furious, welled in her eyes, blurring the cruel words. It wasn't just abandonment. It was a calculated act of erasure, of profiting from her supposed demise. The small wooden bird in her pocket felt like a laid weight. Lydia, her mother, hadn't just died in an accident. And she, Eliza, hadn't just been lost to the system. They had both been victims of Julian Vance's cold, unconscionable greed. His charitable foundation, Eliza, choked out the words, thick with dawning horror, the one in Lydia's name. It was all built on this, on our deaths. It appears so, Eleanor confirmed grimly. The timing, the initial seed money, it all points to him using the tragedy of losing his wife and daughter as a platform for public sympathy and, ironically, financial gain through his so-called philanthropy. A masterstroke of manipulation, if you can stomach calling it that. Eleanor's lips thinned. Some men build empires with steel and concrete. Julian Vance built his with lies and stolen lives. A tremor ran through Eliza, a deep, visceral rage mixed with an almost unbearable grief. Grief for the mother she never knew, grief for the childhood that had been stolen from her, and a burning, incandescent rage for the man who had orchestrated it all. The faint, unsettling echoes she'd felt in the Vance estate now made a terrible, sickening sense. They were the whispers of her own stolen life, crying out from within those opulent walls. Suddenly, Eleanor's phone buzzed with a text message. She glanced at it, her brow furrowing. "That was my contact at City Hall," she said, her voice sharpening with a new urgency. Someone's been making discreet inquiries about old Vance family records, specifically anything pertaining to Lydia Vance and any children. They were asking about who might have accessed them recently. Eliza's blood ran cold. "He knows Vance knows we're looking. He might not know who we are specifically," Eleanor said, her eyes narrowed in thought. "But he's a man who guards his secrets like a dragon guards its hoard. He's been alerted. He'll be tightening his security, covering his tracks, perhaps even looking for who's been stirring the ashes." She looked directly at Eliza. "We don't have much time. If we're going to act, it has to be now before he buries this truth so deep, even I can't find it again." The moment hung heavy in the air. The danger, once a distant shadow, was now a palpable presence breathing down their necks. But the fear that had once threatened to paralyze Eliza was now eclipsed by a cold, hard resolve. She looked at the forged death certificate, bearing her name at the loving face of Lydia Vance, in a faded newspaper clipping Eleanor had found at the irrefutable evidence of Julian Vance's monstrous betrayal. The price of justice. It could be her life, but the price of silence was her soul. "What do we do?" Eliza asked, her voice surprisingly steady, clear as a bell in the quiet room. The tears had stopped. In their place was a chilling calm, the calm of a storm about to break. Eleanor Hayes met her gaze, a spark of something akin to pride in her steely eyes. "We do what your mother would have wanted, Eliza. We make him pay. We bring the truth into the light, no matter how blinding." The week leading up to the annual Vance Foundation Charity Gala was a blur of tense preparations for Eliza Munro and Eleanor Hayes. Their plan was audacious, fraught with risk, but it was their only chance to expose Julian Vance on a stage of his own making, before an audience that had long been captivated by his carefully crafted illusion of benevolence. Eleanor, with her network of old contacts, arranged for discreet tip-offs to a few trusted journalists, and more crucially to certain federal authorities who had long harbored quiet suspicions about Vance's more opaque financial dealings, but lacked the irrefutable proof Eleanor now possessed. Eliza's role was more direct, more dangerous. She would be the voice, the accuser, the living embodiment of the truth Julian Vance had tried to bury. The night of the gala arrived cloaked in a cold, glittering darkness. The grand ballroom of the city's most prestigious hotel was a sea of diamonds, designer gowns, and self-congratulatory smiles. Julian Vance, immaculate in his bespoke tuxedo, moved among his guests like a benevolent monarch, his every pronouncement on philanthropy met with fawning applause. Eliza, dressed in a simple dark server's uniform, she'd procured her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest, watched him from the periphery. Every polite laugh, every magnanimous gesture he made was a fresh twist of the knife in her soul. The small wooden bird was nestled in her pocket, a silent anchor. Eleanor, looking surprisingly at home, in an understated but elegant pantsuit, blended into the background, a subtle signal arranged between them for when the moment was right. The plan was for Eliza to gain access to a secondary microphone during a brief interlude in Vance's keynote address under the guise of a special announcement coordinated by the hotel staff, a detail Eleanor had meticulously arranged through a contact who owed her a significant favor. As Julian Vance ascended the stage, bathed in the warm glow of spotlights, A hush fell over the room. He began his speech, his voice smooth and resonant, weaving a narrative of compassion, of overcoming personal tragedy, to dedicate his life to the less fortunate. He spoke of his beloved late wife, Lydia, and the foundation established in her name. Eliza felt a cold rage build within her, a righteous fury that sharpened her resolve. This man, this monster, dared to invoke her mother's name to legitimize his empire of lies. The prearranged signal came, a subtle nod from Eleanor near the sound technician's booth. It was time. Her legs felt like lead, but she moved, slipping through the bustling service staff, her eyes fixed on the small podium microphone just off to the side of the main lectern. Vance was pausing for dramatic effect after a particularly moving anecdote about helping an orphaned child. This was her opening. Before anyone could react, before Vance could resume, Eliza was at the secondary microphone. Her voice amplified, cut through the expectant silence of the ballroom, clear and surprisingly steady. "Excuse me, Mr. Vance. If I may." A collective gasp rippled through the audience. Heads turned. Julian Vance, startled, frowned in her direction, a flicker of annoyance, then cold recognition dawning in his eyes as she stepped further into the light. He remembered the waitress from his home. "This is highly irregular," Vance began his voice, tight with controlled anger. "Security. My name is Eliza Munro," she continued, her voice gaining strength, ignoring him addressing the stunned audience. "And I believe Mr. Vance knows why I'm here. He speaks tonight of philanthropy, of helping orphaned children, of the tragic loss of his wife, Lydia Vance." Her gaze locked with Julian's, unwavering. "But there's another tragedy he conveniently fails to mention. The tragedy of another child. His own daughter." A shocked murmur swept the room. Vance's face, a moment ago composed and benevolent, was now a mask of disbelief, rapidly contorting into fury. "This is outrageous! Remove this woman!" But Eliza pressed on her voice, ringing with emotion. "He didn't just lose a daughter, ladies and gentlemen. He erased her. He had me. Eliza Lydia. Vance declared legally dead 20 years ago. She pulled a sheaf of papers from her server's apron. Copies of the birth certificate, the forged death certificate, the insurance claims, all meticulously compiled by Eleanor. He did it to claim an insurance payout. He did it perhaps because a living child was an inconvenience after he orchestrated the death of my mother, Lydia Vance, for her fortune. The ballroom erupted. Shouts of disbelief, angry denials from Vance's associates, the frantic flashing of cameras from the journalists Eleanor had tipped off. Julian Vance lunged for the microphone, but hotel security, alerted by Eleanor, and now thoroughly confused, hesitated. "It's all here," Eliza cried, holding up the documents. "The proof of his greed, his deceit, his monstrous betrayal. The man you hail as a philanthropist built his empire on the ashes of my mother's life and my stolen childhood. His foundation is a sham, a monument to his hypocrisy. Julian Vance, his face a ghastly shade of pale, his eyes darting wildly, tried to shout her down, but his voice was lost in the growing uproar. The carefully constructed facade of Julian Vance, billionaire benefactor, was crumbling before the eyes of the city's elite broadcast, live by the scrambling news crews. Then, through the chaos, another set of figures began to move with purpose towards the stage. Not hotel security, but grim-faced men and women in dark suits, badges glinting. The federal authorities. Eleanor Hayes, standing near the exit, watched the scene unfold with a look of grim satisfaction. She caught Eliza's eye for a fleeting second and gave a barely perceptible nod. As the agents surrounded a now sputtering, incoherent Julian Vance, Eleanor permitted herself a small, dry observation to a stunned socialite beside her, who was lamenting the ruined evening. "Well, my dear," Eleanor murmured, "it seems the champagne isn't the only thing that's lost its fizz tonight. So has Mr. Vance's reputation, and I dare say his freedom." Eliza watched a strange numbness settling over her as Julian Vance, the man who was her father, the architect of her lifelong sorrow, was escorted off the stage, his cries of innocence and outrage swallowed by the cacophony. The cameras flashed, the crowd surged, questions were shouted. She had done it. The truth was out. Justice in its raw, chaotic form was being served. But as the initial surge of adrenaline and vindication began to ebb, a vast, hollow emptiness opened within her. The fight that had consumed her for weeks, for months, was over. The monster had been unmasked, but the victory felt different than she'd imagined. There was no elation, no triumphant joy, only a profound weariness and the aching, undeniable truth of her origins. She was the daughter of a murderer, a fraud, a man who had tried to erase her from existence. Standing alone, amidst the glittering debris of Julian Vance's shattered world, the lights of the news cameras still blinding her, Eliza Munro felt the full weight of her stolen past and the daunting, uncertain landscape of a future she now had to build from the ruins. The price of justice had been paid, but the cost to her own soul was a tally that was only just beginning. 6 months had passed since the night the glittering facade of Julian Vance's life had shattered under the weight of exposed truth. 6 months since he had been led away in handcuffs, his name transformed from a symbol of philanthropic prestige to a byword for monstrous deceit. The courts had moved with uncharacteristic speed, spurred by the mountain of irrefutable evidence Eleanor Hayes had compiled and the ensuing public outcry. Julian Vance was now inmate number 7429, stripped of his fortune, his reputation, and his freedom, beginning a lengthy sentence for fraud, conspiracy, and contributing to the wrongful death of Lydia Vance. The empire built on lies had crumbled to dust. For Eliza Munro, these months had been a turbulent passage through a landscape of grief, anger, and a slow, tentative search for healing. The initial hollowness that followed the confrontation had gradually given way to the painstaking work of confronting her own fractured past. Eleanor Hayes remained a steadfast, pragmatic presence, her bungalow becoming a surprising sanctuary for Eliza. Eleanor, with her gruff empathy and endless supply of terrible coffee, never offered platitudes, only a listening ear, and the occasional sharply insightful piece of advice. "The past is a beast," Eliza Eleanor had said one afternoon, watching Eliza stare blankly at a rain-streaked window. "You can let it devour you, or you can learn to walk alongside it. It'll always be there, mind you. But you get to choose who holds the leash." It was Eleanor, too, who had gently prodded Eliza to search for any remaining family of Lydia Beaumont Vance. Armed with Lydia's maiden name and a few details from Eleanor's investigation, Eliza had embarked on a new, quieter search. It led her surprisingly quickly to a woman named Rachel Henderson, a warm-eyed art teacher living in a small town in Vermont. Lydia's younger sister, Eliza's aunt. Their first meeting in a sun-dappled cafe was a cascade of hesitant words, shared tears, and the dawning, miraculous recognition of family. Rachel, her eyes, so like the faded photographs of Lydia, had searched for news of her niece for years after Lydia's death, and Julian's vague, dismissive explanations, before finally heartbreakingly giving up hope. "Oh, my dear girl." Rachel had whispered, her hand trembling as she reached across the table to clutch Eliza's. "You have her smile, your mother's exact smile." And then, with a watery chuckle that was pure warmth, though Lydia was far more likely to use hers to charm her way into a protest march than you seem to be, at least so far. Through Rachel, Lydia Vance came alive for Eliza, not as a tragic victim, but as a vibrant, passionate woman, a fierce advocate for children, a lover of wildflowers and unconventional art, a woman who, had Rachel revealed, kept meticulous journals. These journals passed to Eliza, with reverence, were filled with Lydia's dreams, her frustrations with Julian's burgeoning obsession with wealth, and her fierce, all-encompassing love for her baby daughter, her little bird, Eliza. Reading her mother's words, Eliza felt a profound connection, a sense of being loved and wanted that had been absent her entire life. The pain of her loss was immense, yet intertwined with it now was a sense of fierce pride and a burgeoning purpose. Julian Vance had tried to erase Lydia's legacy as surely as he had tried to erase Eliza. He would not succeed. The legal battles to untangle Julian's estate were complex, but a significant portion of the assets directly linked to Lydia's original fortune and the insurance policies he'd fraudulently claimed were eventually wrested from the wreckage. It wasn't about the money for Eliza, but what it represented, a chance to reclaim what was stolen, to rewrite a narrative of greed into one of hope. With Rachel's loving support and Eleanor's sharp, practical guidance, the Lydia Vance Foundation was reborn. Not as a hollow monument to a lie, but as a living tribute to a woman's spirit. Its mission was clear: to support underprivileged children, to advocate for reforms in the foster care system, to give voice to those who, like Eliza, had once been lost in the shadows. Eleanor, visiting their small, bustling new office a year later, surveyed the organized chaos of files, far more neatly arranged than her own. She noted with a smirk the earnest young volunteers and Eliza, who now moved with a quiet confidence, her eyes clear and focused. "Well, Monroe," Eleanor said, accepting a cup of coffee that was, she had to admit, exceptionally good. From exposing one billionaire's con to trying to save the world one child at a time. "You don't do things by halves, do you?" She winked. "Your mother would be insufferably proud." Eliza smiled, a genuine, unburdened smile that reached her eyes. The small wooden bird, her mother's gift, now sat on her desk, no longer a symbol of a painful mystery, but a reminder of an unbreakable bond and a legacy of love. The city of Chicago still hummed its relentless tune outside her window. But now, for Eliza Monroe, it was a different kind of music. The void in her past had been filled not with fairy tales, but with a complex, sometimes painful truth she could finally call her own. The scars remained thin, silver lines etched upon her soul, a testament to the battles she had fought and survived. But they no longer defined her. She had learned to walk alongside the beast of her past, as Eleanor had said, and in doing so, she had found her own strength, her own voice, her own earned peace. She was no longer just Eliza Monroe, the waitress who saw a photograph. She was Eliza Monroe, Lydia Vance's daughter, a woman who had looked into the abyss and chosen to build a bridge of hope across it for herself and for all the other lost birds still searching for a place to land. Her story, once stolen, was now gloriously, irrevocably her own. Eliza Monroe's journey from a life lived in the shadow of an unknown past to becoming the architect of her own luminous legacy is a profound testament to the enduring power of truth. How many of us, in our own quiet ways, carry fragments of stories that shape us sometimes without us even knowing their full scope, and what does it truly take to reclaim our narrative, to step out of the echoes and find our own clear voice? Her courage to confront a devastating betrayal and then to build a bridge of hope from the ruins reminds us that even the deepest wounds can be pathways to incredible strength. This story of resilience and the quest for identity has deeply moved us, and we imagine it may have stirred something within you as well. What part of Eliza's transformation resonated most with you? Was it her unwavering courage in the face of such overwhelming odds, or her profound strength in choosing to forge a legacy of compassion rather than remaining consumed by bitterness? We pour our hearts into bringing these narratives to life, and your insights truly help us shape what we do. If you have any thoughts on today's story, the way it was told, or even ideas that could make our future journeys even more compelling, please share them in the comments below. Your voice is essential to our growth. If Eliza's story of unearthing truth and rebuilding with purpose touched your heart, we'd be so grateful for a like. And if you feel this story of courage could offer strength or a moment of reflection to someone else, we warmly invite you to share it. For more stories that delve into the complexities of the human spirit and the remarkable capacity for healing, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell. Let's continue to explore these meaningful paths together. And while you're here, why not discover another tale of unexpected truths and powerful transformations waiting for you on your screen now? Until next time, may your own story be filled with courage, understanding, and enduring hope. Take care.